All right, everyone, welcome back to the Crypto Power Hour. Kind of got an exclusive interview for you here. We want to know everything about SBF and what's going on here. I decided to bring on Carlo. I'm very excited for you to join us. Go ahead and give yourself a little introduction.
Yeah, so my name is Carlo D'Angelo. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I have an emphasis on crypto criminal crime. I go by the tag at DeFi Defense Law on Twitter, and my website is defidefenselawyer.com. And I'm delighted to be here with you.
Just as a full disclosure, none of anything that you are listening to is financial or legal advice. I have to say that it's one of my favorite things I have to kind of put out there, but we'll kind of get right into it right here. I'll also throw up your Twitter.
Sure.
So if people want to go follow you on there, if they got any questions or anything, come straight to you. Give us a quick breakdown of pretty much the indictment of SBF, arrest, and everything pretty much that you can.
Sure. So it's been pretty widely reported that he was arrested in the Bahamas on an arrest warrant. That arrest warrant came out of the Southern District of New York. The U.S. Attorney's Office, the morning after his arrest in the Bahamas, unsealed the indictment. It's an 8-count indictment. The counts are basically all some form of wire fraud. There are some components of securities and commodities fraud worked into the indictment, as well as a money laundering count. And the most interesting count, this campaign fraud count. So basically, there are 4 general areas where they are looking to prosecute him. They're looking to prosecute him for fraud involving investors in FTX.com, fraud involving loans that were made through FTX.com and Alameda Research, another company that he is alleged to have controlled. The other component is lenders involved in Alameda Research and FTX.com. And then the final is that he made massive political contributions to both sides of the aisle, and the government believes that the monies used to make those political contributions were also somehow tied to the fraud.
Sure. And how serious are these charges?
Very serious. And I'm not saying anything that isn't a surprise to anyone. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York gave a press conference yesterday and described this as basically one of the biggest fraud cases in U.S. history. It's on a Madoff level.
What is the timeline going to look like for SBF and this, like, the seriousness of these sentencings?
So the timeline is a little bit up in the air right now because he's overseas in custody in the Bahamas. He appeared yesterday before the Bahamian court and made a request for bail pending extradition. He wanted a $250,000 bail. That way he could be released while he, I presume, wants to challenge extradition back to the United States on these charges. The court denied that request, and he's been held over with a new status hearing, I believe, on February 8th. Now the question is, what is he going to do? If he sits in a Bahamian jail, and if the conditions in that jail are not very good, being overseas in foreign custody can sometimes influence individuals to change their mind as far as opposing extradition. So let's say he agrees to extradition. He'll be flown probably back to New York, and then he'll make an initial appearance in front of a federal judge. He'll be formally advised of the charges against him. He'll plead not guilty to those charges, and then he'll have to take up the issue of whether the court will set a reasonable bond in his case. The government's going to probably ask for serious pretrial restrictions in this case because of the severity of the offense, the sentencing exposure he's facing, and the fact that he clearly has ties overseas to the Bahamas. So the next hotly contested thing will be release pending trial.
I kind of wanted you to also go over the sentencing guidelines. I saw your huge Twitter thread. There was a huge graphic that had a whole everything kind of chopped up. If you could explain that super quick as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in federal court, when it comes to white collar crime and when it comes to fraud cases, sentencing guidelines control what judges look to as the advisory starting point for where to sentence an individual. Federal judges are not bound by those guidelines, but they are advisory. When you're looking at a fraud guideline, one of the first considerations is the amount of loss. The allegations in this case, I've heard anywhere from $8 to $10 billion, could be more, could be less, who knows. But either of those numbers goes off the charts because the highest fraud guideline there is $500 million or more. So when you calculate those guidelines, it puts him at a level in the guideline chart that I had put in my Twitter post of a 37. That puts him in roughly the range of about a 20-year prison sentence. Where it gets very complicated for Sam Bankman is that, much like the Madoff case, if he is found guilty, if he pleads guilty or is convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, each count carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison. So you have the guidelines on one side, and then you have the statutory maximum penalty. If the guidelines are in excess of the maximum penalty, just like in the Madoff case, what can happen is, under the guidelines, the federal court has the discretion to consecutively sentence the defendant for each count. So if there's 20-year counts and they're all stacked up on each other, that gets you closer to what the guideline range looks like in a case like this. That's how Madoff got a 150-year sentence.
So what are we looking at for SBF here? Could this be a life in prison?
It's been reported that that is within the realm of possibility. It will depend on the loss calculations. It will depend on the number of counts that he either pleads guilty to or is convicted of, and it will depend on the discretion of the sentencing judge. What was obviously devastating in the Madoff case was the testimony of victims of the fraud who came forward and said that their financial situation was pretty much devastated by the fraud in this case. If you have that sort of similar victim impact testimony in a case like this, it could persuade a federal judge to sentence him consecutively to multiple counts. And in theory, that could run up to a sentence that could amount to the rest of his life. Worst case scenario.
Now, are the SEC charges and the CFTC charges also going to be a major player in that as well if a judge looks at it?
So what happened in this case is interesting, and it looks like, based on the press conference that I saw, that this was a joint effort by the SEC, the CFTC, which controls commodities trading, and the Department of Justice. The SEC and the CFTC dropped civil complaints on Bankman. They were pretty much revealed simultaneous with the unsealing of the indictment, which suggests that this was a unified front. Now, the SEC and the CFTC can make a referral for criminal investigation, but I think what's going to happen is he's going to be fighting a battle in civil court with respect to the SEC and the CFTC lawsuit, while at the same time defending this 8-count criminal indictment. So he'll be fighting a war on two fronts, it sounds like.
And we know there's multiple people involved in anything, but SBF is pretty much the first one to get nailed, like with all these charges. Is it possible for other people to start getting charged? Anybody else to kind of start popping?
I think it's beyond possible because in listening to the press conference yesterday, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York made it very clear that although this was a very swift investigation and prosecution, that there is more to come. And he, in fact, publicly urged people that if they have any involvement in this case, it would be advisable for them to come forward before the DOJ comes looking for them. And remember, the indictment talks about co-conspirators. So there are other individuals involved. They might be individuals who cooperated, meaning they are unindicted co-conspirators, or they may be individuals who are not yet known to the grand jury. But under any scenario, I could easily foresee more defendants coming into the fold in this case.
And pretty much prior to all of this, SBF was like on Twitter Spaces. He was doing interviews like on Good Morning America. Like I said earlier, not legal or financial advice, but from a lawyer's perspective, was it smart to do any of these interviews?
I host a Twitter space called LexLine, where we get together 4 days a week and we talk about new and emerging events in Web3 law. And we have collectively been talking about these public Twitter spaces and these Twitter comments that he's been making. And I can't see many lawyers out there thinking that this is a good idea because he's just potentially further incriminating himself. And a smart prosecutor is going to take those recordings and is going to take those tweets and either blow them up on a big screen in front of a jury, because there are a lot of admissions of fault there, and they could also have a serious impact during the sentencing hearing. I just can't see a lot of good coming from making those public-facing statements, and I think it could prove to be detrimental for him. In white-collar cases like this, the typical defense may be that, well, he's young, he didn't understand, he got over his skis, it's a startup, he was trying and he failed, but very clear policies with respect to how investor funds would be treated. And the allegations in this case seem to run contrary to the very public-facing policy as far as investor funds. And to say that that was simply an error in judgment may not go over well with a jury.
Carlo, I want to thank you for taking the time. I think you've answered everything that I wanted you to super quickly, and I think everything is very in-depth. If anybody has any other questions, like I said, I will link below Carlo's Twitter handle. Go ask him. I will also probably link his great thread that he did breaking all of this stuff down. It's got graphics. It's super, super great. Follow him as well and tune into LexLine. Keep up to date with everything as it's going down with, updates. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone enjoyed this little interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.